Welcome back. It's been over 2 years since the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture kicked off in terms of public hearings. Deputy Chief Justice Ray Zondo and his team are investigating a series of allegations of corruption in organs of state. Former President Jacob Zuma, a number of politicians and state-owned entities have given damning testimonies before the Commission. The Commission is expected to wrap up in March next year. I'm now joined by this panel, former Public Protector Thuli Madonsela, researcher from Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI, Ivor Chipkin, and journalist Erin Bates, a freelance journalist. You will remember her, of course, from her days here at ENCA. In fact, on that note, let me get straight to it then. Let me start with you, Professor Thuli Madonsela, and ask you, all of this was triggered by some of the work that you were doing when you were in the office of the Public Protector. And I remember the amount of contention there was as to the appointment of the Commission. And finally, we got to a point where it was appointed and given its marching orders. Looking back on it all, is it unraveling the truth that you could not get to, given your resources and time constraints at the time?
Absolutely. Firstly, just greetings and thank you for the privilege. The Commission is definitely unraveling or excavating the truths that we couldn't uncover with the limited resources and time we had. It's taking longer than I anticipated, but I think the Commission was deliberately sabotaged by expanding its mandate because, as you know, I had to investigate specific allegations. And when I suggested or ordered that the Commission be established, it was to finish an already started investigation. But then the terms of reference we expanded. I know everyone is regaled, for example, by what's coming from Bosasa, but that shouldn't have come into this. We should have finished that, and then maybe the Commission could have gone to phase 2 and then had Bosasa and all of the other things. It's the same way. If Dlamini was killed, please investigate who killed Dlamini before you find out who also killed Simelane.
Yeah, I hear that. And I guess it comes back to this issue of the whataboutism that sometimes happens in our society. Do you get a sense that there was an attempt to accommodate that, to say you don't want to be seen to be selective and ignoring other schemes of corruption?
That's exactly that, and I think that was deliberate. But what it has done is, firstly, it has allowed those who stole money from the public purse to liquidate that money. If I bought property with state capture money, by this time, that property has exchanged 5 different hands. Money is all over the world. So the reason we wanted a commission of inquiry was with a view to having something that was going to be prompt and rigorous. But anyway, yes, it did go into that. What about that one? Hence, Bosasa, for example, if you look at that inquiry, it was deliberately designed to bring the current president into the story, because Bosasa goes into him having to disclose his own political funding. But my concern about that is that we had to deal with somebody who's already been killed as opposed to a hitman or somebody who's been given money that we suspect is money for him to be a hitman. I thought that the best thing was to investigate, firstly, the death that has already occurred.
Interesting. And the analogies that you used there, Professor Thuli Madonsela. Let me bring in my other guest and bring it back to studio before I go to Erin there. And Ivor, you and a team of others went into this way before we had any significant movement by way of, this commission hitting the ground running. In your report, Betrayal of the Promise. To what extent do you believe the current proceedings in the Commission and the work that the Commission has done is helping us sort of rebuild the promise that has been betrayed?
Yeah, fabulous questions. And just as a point of clarity, I'm the director of the Government and Public Policy think tank. I'm no longer with the Public
Affairs Research.
No problem, no problem. Yes, 2017, myself, Mark Swilling, working with a group of people, working often clandestinely, gathering information that was already in the public domain, some of it put into the public domain by the former Public Protector. It's a great pleasure to be on the same platform with her. Gathering documents from government and other parts which we could source, work of journalists, trying to tell a story of what happened. And of course the betrayal of the Promise Report was like letting off a bomb in South Africa. The impact was enormous. I think what's important, and where the conversation I think has drifted, I think the former Public Protector's points now are really prescient and profound in terms of the critique of the current process. Where I'm a little bit concerned about where the conversation's going is our preoccupation with corruption as a personal attribute of individuals, greedy individuals, or enrichment, as if we treat this as the scorecard, which I saw earlier, for example, how many people are in jail. I think that's very, very useful. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that have stolen a whole lot of money which must be adequately penalised. But what we were arguing in the betrayal of the Promise Report was to try to place state capture in a much larger political context, thinking in relationship to the history of apartheid, the massive economic inequalities which apartheid produced, and a sincere attempt to transform the economy, which we argued went very, very wrong. So we developed a term which we called repurposing institutions, focusing on the state-owned enterprises, Transnet and Eskom, an attempt to use those institutions not to achieve their formal mandates, provide electricity, reduce transport costs, etc., but to use those institutions to achieve economic transformation. And we argue that project came up against the Constitution and it ultimately turned criminal. So what we argued is that in addressing state capture, what one had to do was address these larger structural issues, not simply arrest a couple of individuals that went rogue.
All right. So in a moment I will ask you about the extent to which then there's been a bit of steering it back in terms of the institutions that you're talking about that were repurposed. To what extent we've seen successful attempts to steer them back to their original purpose. But I want to bring in Erin Bates before I ask you that question. And Erin, you're a storyteller, right? When you look at the narrative that's been coming out of the Commission of Inquiry, what is the grand story that stands out for you? What do we know right now that we didn't know at the point at which Professor Thuli Madonsela's report finally was, a report that needed to be acted upon without any further ado?
Well, one thing we do know is former President Jacob Zuma's own take on this phenomenon or alleged phenomenon of state capture, even though he perhaps under duress signed into effect the recommendations and regulations for the Commission as stipulated in the remedial action of the Public Protector's State of Capture report, he to this day maintains that state capture didn't occur. And of course, his sole appearance before the Commission to date was a remarkable week of sort of political storytelling of its own kind. So certainly we've seen that. We've seen some of the MOs, the modus operandi of capturers of institutions like Eskom, Transnet, Denel, and SAA. And I think in some ways, Thulas, we've also seen what is effectively a political arena. The very inquiries process is almost like a political forum where we see different factions and different ideologies contesting before the Deputy Chief Justice.
All right, that's actually a good point that you make there, Erin. Let me bring it back to you then, Ivor Chipkin, and ask you about much of what you were talking about is systemic rather than being about individuals and their pockets of criminality. Your story with the betrayal of the promise was that this became a system that encouraged rent-seeking, partly through repurposing of institutions. So there's been a lot of movement. There are many streams with the Commission, for example. Some look at law enforcement, some look at SOEs, you will have your ESCOMs, your Denel, SABC, etc. What is your sense? Is the train steering back slightly with some of the changes that have been happening parallel to the Commission?
So I think parallel to the Commission, there are some important developments at the state-owned enterprises. The appointment of a new group executive at Transnet. There are some important changes going on. I think Transnet is interesting in the regard that I think Transnet, the level of sabotage of Transnet was much less profound than it was at Eskom. So I think there was the criminalisation of a leadership which were deeply complicit, but I think general day-to-day operations were less affected. And it means that at Transnet, from what I can see from the outside, there's a much greater chance of the organisation bouncing back more quickly. At Eskom, my sense is, though, that the hollowing out of that institution was much, much more profound. And the depth, therefore, if you want to use the word capture, was much more profound. So it's not just that the senior executive were complicit in criminality and in fraud and in theft, but that what went with it was a huge hollowing out of the operations of the organisation. One of the key areas which explains the incredible instability of the electricity grid today was the moving out of experienced power station managers, bringing in highly inexperienced people in, and the weakening of the ability to run the power stations in a context where the South African power stations, many of them are very, very old, nearly 50 years old. So complex institutions to manage, inexperienced people running them, and I think that goes a long way to explain the current crisis.
All right, Ivor, let's hold it there for a moment. Let me bring in Thuli Madonsela very quickly. About a minute, Prof. Madonsela. There will be some South Africans who are saying, why didn't the then Public Protector simply make recommendations to say, prosecute X, Y, and Z? Why was it important for us to have this experience? Because, some people are frustrated that at the end of it all, it's not like you will take Justice Ray Zondo's report and present it in court in whole and say, here's the evidence, you either convict or acquit people. Why was this particular process important before we get to the judicial processes?
This process was important for justice. Justice shouldn't just be done.
All right. As these things do happen from time to time, we do seem to be losing the feed there from Professor Thuli Madonsela, but we will try and re-establish the connection to her. She was sort of explaining the point of having a commission of inquiry as opposed to going directly to the root of prosecution. Hopefully we can get it back. We can get it back. This is your corruption scorecard here on ENCA. Stand by. In just a moment we continue with our panel. Professor Thuli Madonsela, Ivor, Chipkin and Erin Bates.